1. Welcome back to the second episode, everyone. Thank you for the love and support. Let's dive in. In a bustling metropolis filled with towering skyscrapers and people always in a rush, there lived a young woman named Grace. She had no roof over her head, no family to call her own, and no one to share her sorrows with. Yet, she possessed something far greater than wealth, hope, the gentle star of a baby growing inside her, and a deep passion for dance that refused to fade away. Each dawn, before the streets flooded with hurried footsteps and blaring horns, Grace would wander to the nearby park carrying her battered old radio and a small metal cup. Her bare feet met the cold earth, her faded dress fluttered in the morning breeze, and her tangled hair was tied with a fraying ribbon that had long lost its color. But the moment her radio crackled to life and the first tune began to play, Grace transformed. She was no longer a destitute woman surviving from day to day, she became art in motion. Her movements painted silent stories in the air, tales of joy, heartbreak, and dreams too stubborn to die. Occasionally, passers-by paused to watch her. Some smiled, others whispered or shook their heads before moving on. A few kind hearts dropped coins into her cup, each tiny clink like a heartbeat reminding her that life still noticed her. Those coins meant food, water, or a spot in a shelter for the night. But to Grace, dance was never about money. When she danced, she escaped her pain. She forgot the betrayal of the man who had vanished after discovering her pregnancy. The hunger and loneliness became distant memories, replaced by rhythm and light. For a brief, shining moment, Grace felt alive, as though she and her unborn child could still have a beautiful tomorrow. One warm afternoon, the park was serene. The wind carried the scent of blooming jasmine, and sunlight glimmered on the river like scattered jewels. Grace stood near the water's edge, stretching before her next routine, when she noticed something, a small girl seated in a wheelchair on the opposite path. The child couldn't have been older than 6. Her fragile hands rested limply on her lap, her large brown eyes staring blankly at the slow-moving river. Even from across the way, Grace could sense the heavy sadness surrounding her. It was a silence that felt louder than any cry. Grace's heart ached. She recognized that emptiness, the look of someone who had lost something irreplaceable. After a brief hesitation, she glanced down at her swollen belly and the few coins rattling in her cup, then whispered, maybe a little dance could help. She switched on her radio, and an old tune drifted through the breeze. Grace began to dance, not her usual graceful swirls, but exaggerated, playful moves. She pretended to trip, jumped like a frog, and made silly faces. At first, the girl just blinked, expressionless. Grace spun faster, flapping her arms like a bird. She puffed her cheeks, crossed her eyes, and acted so ridiculous that even the pigeons seemed to watch in curiosity. Then, the impossible happened, the girl giggled. It was soft at first, then grew into a full, melodic laugh. Grace froze mid-spin and gasped theatrically. Wait a second, did I just hear you laugh at me? The girl nodded, laughing harder. Grace put her hands on her hips. Oh no, now you've done it. You've unlocked my super silly mode. She hopped on one leg, twirled her scarf like a cape, and bowed dramatically. The little girl clapped so hard her laughter echoed through the park. Grace's smile widened. That laughter, pure and unrestrained, filled something empty inside her. For the first time in days, she didn't feel hungry or weary. She just felt human. A short distance away, a man stood frozen, holding 2 melting ice cream cones. His name was James Lawson, and his heart nearly stopped when he heard that sound, his daughter's laughter. Little Ada hadn't laughed since the accident. The memory still haunted him, the screeching tires, his wife's soft cry, the blinding crash. He had been driving too fast, chasing a flight they never caught. When he woke in the hospital, his wife was gone, and Ada could no longer move her legs. Doctors called her survival a miracle. To James, it felt like punishment. No amount of money could heal the guilt that weighed him down. He took Ada to specialists across the country, but she stopped talking, smiling, and even drawing. His once bubbly daughter had withdrawn into silence. But today, something changed, and the source of that miracle was a barefoot dancer with a broken radio. James stood still, tears gathering in his eyes as he watched Ada laugh for the first time in months. When Grace finally noticed him walking toward them, she panicked, thinking he might scold her for disturbing the child. Quickly, she picked up her cup. Instead, James crouched beside Ada and said softly, "I could hear you laughing all the way from the ice cream stand." "Daddy." Ada grinned, her entire face glowing. "She's funny. She dances like a bird." Grace flushed, tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear. "I just wanted to cheer her up, sir." She looked so sad. James's voice quivered. You don't know how long it's been since I've seen her smile like that." Grace smiled gently. "Sometimes all it takes is a little laughter." Ada reached out, her tiny fingers brushing Grace's arm. "You dance so funny. Can you come dance again tomorrow?" Grace blinked in surprise. No one ever asked her to return. Usually, people watched, tossed a coin, and left. "Tomorrow," she repeated softly. "Please." Ada begged. Grace hesitated. Her life was unpredictable, every night could bring rain, hunger, or danger. But when she saw the sparkle of hope in Ada's eyes, she nodded. "All right, sunshine. If my radio still works, I'll be here." Ada squealed, clapping her hands. James smiled faintly and offered one of the cones. "Here," he said. "You made my daughter's day." Grace accepted it as though it were gold. "Thank you," she whispered. The cold sweetness melted on her tongue, tasting like kindness. As the sun dipped behind the skyline, Ada waved goodbye, and Grace waved back, whispering, "See you tomorrow, sunshine." When the park grew empty, Grace sat by the riverbank, one hand resting on her round belly. The baby kicked softly, almost as if in rhythm. "Did you see that, little one?" she murmured. "We made someone smile today." That night, James tucked Ada into bed as she told him stories about Grace, the funny dancer who twirled like a superhero. "Daddy," she said through a yawn, "I want her to come every day." James kissed her forehead. "We'll see her tomorrow." For the first time in years, their home didn't feel hollow. Across the city, under her usual bench, Grace wrapped herself in her thin blanket. She was cold, but her heart was warm. She closed her eyes and whispered to her unborn baby, "Someday, we'll have our own home. Until then, we'll dance, for joy, for love, and for miracles." She fell asleep smiling beneath a sky full of stars. The next morning arrived with chirping birds and pink skies. Grace woke early, her stomach empty but her spirit full. She cleaned her dress as best she could, grabbed her radio, and walked briskly to the park. When she arrived, Ada was already waiting, waving excitedly from her wheelchair. "Miss Grace, you came." Grace grinned. "Of course. I couldn't miss my favorite audience." Ada laughed, her cheeks glowing. James stood nearby, hands in his pockets, watching with quiet gratitude. Grace pressed play on her radio. The melody filled the air, and she began to move, spinning, leaping, laughing. Her scarf fluttered like a ribbon of sunlight. Ada clapped and squealed, "Do the funny one again." Grace exaggerated a clumsy fall, then popped up heroically. Ada's laughter rang through the park, and even James chuckled softly. When the song ended, Grace sat beside Ada. "You have the most beautiful laugh I've ever heard," she said warmly. "Daddy says I didn't laugh for a long time," Ada whispered. That night, as Grace stepped into the small apartment James had given her, she felt like she had entered another world. The walls were freshly painted a soft cream, the air smelled faintly of new wood and soap, and the floorboards creaked gently under her bare feet. It wasn't much, a single bedroom, a kitchenette, and a window overlooking a narrow street, but to her, it felt like a palace. She walked slowly around the room, touching the walls, the table, the curtains. Each touch felt unreal. "We have a home now," she whispered, resting her hand on her belly. A tiny kick answered her, and tears filled her eyes. "You're going to sleep in a real bed, little one. Not on a bench, not under the rain, a real bed." Grace sank onto the small couch and turned on her radio. It crackled and hissed before a soft tune played, one of her favorites. She closed her eyes and swayed gently, imagining the child she would soon hold, the laughter she would hear, and the life she might finally build. For the first time in years, she felt peace. The following weeks flowed like music. Grace continued to meet Ada at the park every afternoon. Together they created new performances, silly dance routines, storytelling sessions, and even imaginary concerts where Ada conducted with a stick while Grace twirled like a ballerina. They had become inseparable. James often watched from a distance, smiling as his daughter's laughter filled the air. He began to notice subtle changes in Grace too. Her cheeks grew fuller, her steps more assured, her eyes brighter. Hope looked good on her. Sometimes, after Ada's bedtime, James and Grace would sit on a nearby bench, talking quietly under the lamplight. He learned she had once dreamed of joining a dance academy, but life had turned against her after her parents died. She had worked as a cleaner, a waitress, and even a street performer just to survive. Yet, through everything, she had never stopped dancing. "You kept your dream alive," James said one evening, his voice low. Grace smiled faintly. "Dreams are like music," she replied. "You can't see them, but they stay in your heart. Even when life turns off the radio, the melody doesn't stop." James looked at her, admiration softening his features. "You're stronger than most people I know." Grace shook her head. "No. I just kept moving, that's what dancers do." As the days passed, Ada's progress astonished everyone. Her arms grew stronger, and she began using her hands to spin her wheelchair in small circles. She even started trying to stand with the help of braces. Each step, no matter how small, was a celebration. "Miss Grace," she would shout. "Look, I can move a little." Grace would cheer, clapping her hands. "That's my sunshine. You're flying already." One chilly morning, Grace arrived at the park wearing a borrowed coat, her radio tucked under her arm. The winter wind beat at her cheeks, but Ada's laughter warmed her like sunlight. They danced together, Ada spinning her chair, Grace twirling beside her. James recorded them on his phone, his eyes glistening. But as the song ended, Grace suddenly wobbled, pressing a hand to her belly. A sharp pain shot through her. "Oh," she gasped, bending slightly. "Miss Grace!" Ada cried, her smile fading. James rushed forward. "Grace, what's wrong?" "I think," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I think it's time." Her knees buckled, and James caught her just before she fell. Within minutes, he had called for a taxi and was helping her into the back seat. Ada clutched Grace's hand tightly, tears in her eyes. "You'll be okay, right?" Grace forced a smile through the pain. "Don't worry, sunshine. Dancers never fall, we only spin." James squeezed her shoulder. "Hang on, Grace. We'll get you to the hospital." Hours later, under the harsh glow of hospital lights, Grace's cries echoed through the maternity ward. James paced outside, his hands shaking. Ada sat beside him, clutching the fraying ribbon Grace always wore in her hair. It smelled faintly of jasmine and sunlight. Finally, the nurse emerged, smiling. "Congratulations," she said softly. "It's a healthy baby girl." Relief flooded James's face. "Can we see her?" The nurse nodded and led them inside. Grace lay on the bed, exhausted but glowing. In her arms rested a tiny bundle wrapped in a pale pink blanket. The baby's skin was soft as silk, her tiny fingers curling around Grace's thumb. "She's beautiful," James whispered. Grace looked up, eyes shining with tears. "Meet Hope," she said softly. "She's the dance that never ends." Ada wheeled closer, peering at the baby with awe. "She's so small," she whispered. Grace smiled. "Someday, you'll teach her to laugh just like you do." Ada giggled softly. "And you'll teach her to dance." James felt a lump rise in his throat. In that moment, the three of them, the grieving father, the broken dancer, and the brave little girl, felt like a family bound by something deeper than blood, healing. Months passed. Spring returned, painting the city in color once again. Grace's small apartment became filled with warmth, the soft hum of lullabies, the gentle cooing of baby Hope, and frequent visits from James and Ada. Grace often danced with Hope in her arms, humming softly as the baby giggled. Sometimes, Ada joined in, spinning her chair beside them while James clapped in rhythm. Their laughter echoed through the park, becoming a familiar melody to everyone nearby. News of the dancing mother and her little audience began spreading around town. One day, a woman approached Grace after her performance. She introduced herself as the director of a local performing arts center. "I've been watching you for weeks," the woman said. "You have a gift, Grace. Would you consider teaching dance here? We could start with classes for children, even those with disabilities." Grace's eyes widened. "You mean, as a real job?" The woman smiled. "A real job, and a real stage." Tears filled Grace's eyes. "I don't have proper shoes or costumes." "We'll handle that," the director interrupted gently. "Just bring your heart. That's all your students will need." That night, Grace sat by the window holding Hope close. The city lights shimmered outside, and for the first time in her life, the future didn't feel frightening. It felt like a stage waiting for her to step onto it. She whispered to her daughter, "You see, my little one. When you keep dancing through the pain, life finds a rhythm to match yours." Hope stirred softly, her tiny hands reaching upward as if she understood. A year later, the community center auditorium buzzed with excitement. Parents filled the seats, and colorful balloons floated above the stage. At the center stood Grace, now radiant in a flowing white dress, surrounded by children of all ages, including Ada, who stood proudly on braces, ready to perform. As the music began, Grace led them through a simple, joyous routine. Ada moved gracefully, her steps small but steady. The audience erupted in applause as the performance ended, and tears rolled freely down Grace's face. James watched from the front row, his hands trembling as he clapped. Beside him, little Hope, now walking unsteadily, clapped too, squealing with laughter. After the show, reporters gathered around, asking Grace about her journey. She smiled humbly. "I was once a dancer with no home, no stage, and no reason to keep moving. But kindness found me when I least expected it. A little girl's laughter reminded me that light still exists, and it brought me here. Today, I dance not for survival, but for every soul who forgot how to hope." That night, after the crowd dispersed and the hall grew quiet, Grace walked alone onto the empty stage. She closed her eyes, lifted her arms, and began to move. The faint echo of her radio's tune seemed to fill the air again, the same melody that had once played in the park. James watched from the doorway, his heart full. Ada stood beside him, leaning on her braces, smiling. "She's still dancing," she whispered. James nodded softly. "She always will." Years drifted by, soft and unhurried, like pages turning in a well-loved book. Grace's hair silvered, though her eyes still held the same quiet fire that had carried her through life's storms. The academy had grown beyond anything she ever dreamed of, now a wide, sunlit building by the same river where her story had begun. The Hope Academy of Dance and Healing was known across the country. It welcomed children from every walk of life, rich, poor, orphaned, or differently abled. Every wall was covered in framed photos, laughing faces, swirling costumes, newspaper clippings, and certificates of recognition. Yet Grace still refused to hang her own awards. They belong to everyone, she always said, smiling. Hope doesn't wear a single name. Hope, now 21, had inherited her mother's grace and spirit. She danced with effortless elegance, her movements telling stories even words couldn't capture. But she also carried a new vision, blending dance with digital art and film to reach a wider audience. "Mom," she told Grace one morning, spreading out plans on the kitchen table, "I want to build a media studio next to the academy. Imagine kids recording their performances, sharing their journeys online, inspiring others who've never even seen our park." Grace chuckled softly. "When I was your age, I didn't even know how to use a camera." Hope grinned. "That's why you have me." Grace studied her daughter's determined face, feeling a swell of pride so deep it hurt. "You're carrying the torch, my darling, and you're making it shine brighter than ever." One afternoon, Ada, now a poised young woman in her late 20s, visited the academy. She wore a crisp blazer and carried a folder filled with documents. "Guess what?" she said, excitement lighting her face. "We've been invited to open a new branch in Abuja. A hospital wants to partner with us to start a therapy wing." Grace's eyes widened. "That's incredible, Ada." Ada nodded, but then her expression softened. "None of this would have happened without you. You turned a park into a family. You saved me when I didn't believe I had a future." Grace reached out and squeezed her hand. "You saved me too, Ada. I thought I'd lost everything once. Then you and your father showed me what love looks like when it's real." Ada's eyes glistened. "Dad talks about you all the time, you know. He says you taught him to believe again." Grace smiled, a small, wistful smile. "James always had faith, he just needed a reason to use it." That evening, as twilight painted the sky in strokes of gold and violet, Grace sat on a bench overlooking the river. The water shimmered, carrying faint reflections of the city lights. James joined her quietly, sitting close but saying nothing. For a long while, they simply watched the world move. Birds skimmed across the surface. Children laughed in the distance. The scent of rain lingered in the air. Finally, James spoke. "You know, Grace, when I met you, I thought you were broken." Grace turned her head slightly, curious. "And now?" He smiled faintly. "Now I realize you were just becoming whole." Her heart fluttered, not with romance, but with something deeper, something that came from years of shared struggle and understanding. She rested her head gently on his shoulder. "Maybe that's what healing really means. Not forgetting the cracks, but learning how to dance between them." James chuckled softly. "You always find the poetry in pain." Grace smiled. "Because pain taught me how to listen." As the years rolled forward, Grace gradually stepped back from teaching, allowing Hope and Ada to lead. She spent her mornings tending to the small garden behind the academy, a place filled with lilies, hibiscus, and wildflowers she had planted with the children long ago. Every petal, every scent reminded her of a chapter she'd lived through: the park bench, Ada's first smile, Hope's first step, James's quiet laughter. Sometimes, former students would visit, now grown adults with families of their own. They'd hug her tightly and tell her stories of how dance had saved them. One young man brought his daughter, saying, "Miss Grace, you once told me I could fly. I didn't believe you, until I watched my little girl dance." Grace would always laugh and reply, "Then I suppose my wings worked after all." When Grace turned 70, the academy held a grand celebration. The auditorium was filled with people, former students, teachers, sponsors, and families from across the nation. Hope and Ada stood on stage, side by side, their faces glowing with pride. Hope took the microphone. "Today isn't just about an anniversary," she said. It's about a woman who taught us that movement could heal wounds deeper than words, who believed that even broken hearts could dance again. The audience erupted in applause as Grace, tears streaming down her cheeks, slowly made her way to the stage. When the clapping faded, she spoke softly. "I once thought I had nothing, no family, no home, no future. But life showed me that sometimes, losing everything is how we make space for what's meant to be. Hope was once my daughter's name. But now, it belongs to all of you." The crowd rose in a standing ovation. Cameras flashed, children waved banners, and somewhere near the front, James, older now, with gray hair and gentle eyes, wiped a tear from his cheek. That night, after everyone had left, Grace sat alone in the empty hall. The stage lights were dim, casting a soft glow around her. On the floor lay a single rose, dropped by one of the dancers during the performance. She picked it up, twirling it between her fingers, and smiled. A faint breeze drifted through the open window, carrying the laughter of children from the park. She closed her eyes, letting the sound wrap around her like an old lullaby. In that moment, she realized something: she had not just changed lives, she had built a legacy. Her story, once buried beneath hardship, had become a beacon for others lost in darkness. Years later, after Grace passed peacefully in her sleep, the Academy held a tribute. People came from every part of the country: students, teachers, journalists, and families she had touched. Ada spoke first, her voice trembling but strong. "She taught me that disability wasn't the end, it was a new beginning." Hope followed, her voice soft but steady. "My mother taught me that when life breaks your rhythm, you can always find a new beat." At the end of the ceremony, a group of children performed Grace's favorite dance, barefoot, beneath the open sky. Their movements were fluid, free, filled with laughter. As the final note faded, Hope stepped forward, holding a small urn. With tears in her eyes, she scattered her mother's ashes into the river, the same river where her journey began. The water sparkled under the sun, carrying Grace's spirit out to sea. "Dance on, Mama," Hope whispered. "You're everywhere now, in every step, every song, every heartbeat." And so, Hope Academy continued, not just as a school, but as a living story. Children still came, broken and shy, and left dancing with confidence. Teachers told new students about the woman who once danced alone in a park, who built a movement out of kindness and turned pain into rhythm. Every spring, they still held a festival at the river. And at sunset, when the music faded, someone would always step forward and whisper Grace's old words. "This is what hope looks like when it learns to dance."